The Juggernaut is a massive, 10-wheeled, heavy assault vehicle, resembling a hybrid of a heavy IFV carrying dozens of infantrymen and an assault tank designed to breach a well-fortified defensive line. A huge combat machine with very thick armor, packed with weapons, and moving faster than one would expect from such a giant. Only the super-heavy self-propelled artillery, the SPHA, exceeded the size of the wheeled, two-headed giant. Juggernauts were deployed in many large-scale, brutal battles of the Clone Wars and the subsequent Imperial conquest of the Outer Rim. The battles for Kashyyyk, Salakami, Malastare, Plimpto, Jabim, and many other bloody skirmishes did not go without today's hero. Their enemies openly feared them. Any enemy of the Juggernaut understood perfectly well that if this behemoth reached them and poured a rain of laser, plasma, and rockets on them, they would look pale, and then music would play in their home, but they would not hear it. In general, if you're an enemy of the Republic or the Empire, if you're simultaneously hoarse, deaf, and awestruck, you saw and heard it joining the battle, the Juggernaut. I ask you to love and favor it, and if it crushes you, don't complain. I will detail the design and history of the two most common modifications of the super-heavy armored vehicle, the A5 and A6, and briefly discuss the less-known models such as the B5, A4, A5RX, also known as the A5 Recon Juggernaut, and A9. Yes, friends, this beauty has many modifications. The story will be very long, just as you like it. Juggernauts were supposed to appear in a galaxy far, far away back in the distant year of 1980 in Episode 5. These enormous wheeled tanks were supposed to attack the Rebel Alliance base on Hoth. It was a good idea. In the real world, wheeled tanks, often referred to as heavy armored vehicles with tank-caliber guns, were still rare, and in science fiction, they were hard to find even with a searchlight, especially such large armored vehicles. But Lucas considered huge walking combat machines to be more exotic technology, better suited for cinema, and decided to opt for them. Ultimately, Lucas did not lose out. If large-wheeled armored vehicles could somehow be found in science fiction, combat walkers simply did not exist in films of the late 70s and early 80s. The era of walkers and combat humanoid robots would come somewhat later. Precisely because of this novelty, four-legged walkers became one of the symbols of Star Wars. The artist Joe Johnston, commissioned by George Lucas, designed the look of some of the combat machines from the original film trilogy. 9 years later, in 1989, the authors returned to the idea of a huge wheeled armored vehicle, realizing it on the pages of the Imperial sourcebook, one of the first comprehensive guides on our favorite universe published by West End Games for the D6 role-playing system, adapted to the realities of the Star Wars world. Undoubtedly, it's a cult book, which, oddly enough, remains relevant to this day. It was in this sourcebook that the armored vehicle first received its official name, Juggernaut, and the index have you a 5, which stands for Heavy Assault Vehicle. The name wasn't given for no reason. Juggernaut is a word traditionally embodying the notion of unstoppable force and overwhelming power, also used to describe someone who charges ahead, oblivious to obstacles and adversaries. The etymology of this word traces its roots to India and comes from the Sanskrit word Jagannatha, which translates to Lord of the Universe, and is also one of the names of Krishna in Hinduism. The cult of Jagannatha is particularly widespread in the eastern part of India, in the state of Orissa. What can be said, it's hard to come up with a better name for such a powerful combat machine. The first appearance of the Juggernaut in Star Wars fiction occurred in the novel Dark Saber by Kevin Anderson, which was sent to print in the distant year of 1995. Subsequently, the Juggernaut appeared in numerous encyclopedias, reference guides, and fiction works that were well received by fans. George Lucas, wishing to incorporate some elements of the expanded universe into the new trilogy, did not forget about the Juggernauts. Indeed, in the third episode, they were made larger than their counterparts for impact and differed in exterior design. This difference was explained in the reference guide Ravage of the Sith Incredible Cross-Section, which came out the same year, describing the A6 model, the next step in the development of Juggernauts. I'll start the story about the Juggernaut family with the A4 model, because that's where it all began. Surely there were also A3, A2 and A1 models, but we know nothing about them. Generally, wheeled heavy armored vehicles roamed the battlefields of a galaxy far, far away, thousands of years before the events of the films. For example, similar machines were in service with the Sith Empire Army. The first Juggernauts appeared a few centuries before the fall of the Old Republic. This was the A4 model. You will be surprised, but the A4, unlike its successors, had a tracked chassis. There are simply no official illustrations of the A4. But it can be assumed that it looked approximately like the Juggernaut model A5RX. The A4 was armed with 3 laser cannons, whose power was similar to the cannons installed on the A5 model, and this, mind you, despite the several centuries difference in age between these machines. However, the targeting system of the A4 left much to be desired. It was practically manual. Well, at least the cannons weren't muzzle-loaded. The armor of the A4 was just as strong and thick as that of the A5, although in all other respects, the overall survivability of the A4 was somewhat worse, even the durability of the chassis. An additional means of protection for the A4 was a shield generator, which incidentally was not present on subsequent Juggernaut models. The field protected the machine from magnetic bullets, lightning, and ion weapons. The machine was equipped with a set of primitive sensors. Primitive by the standards of the last decades of the Old Republic. The sensors were supplemented by acoustic locators and even older detection means. Although it's unknown whether these locators were originally on the machine or if Min Aerithon installed them. Who is Min Aerithon? I mentioned her for a reason. Since we can view the A4 modification only through the prism of this character, who transformed her A4 into a mobile home, workshop, and office. An armored and armed tracked hut, surely you'd want to have such a house. Min is a talented mechanic and engineer. She gave her Juggernaut an interesting name, Sanctum Sanctorum. She used the Sanctum Sanctorum as a base of operations aboard the Guardian corvette Bishana Baga while working for Arakid Industries. The machine was far more comfortable than an ordinary armored vehicle. There was a cozy cabin, soft sofas, even a small gallery to sit on the terrace with tea or coffee. Having no flesh and blood comrades, Min had to entrust the operation to a droid. The droid brain of her own design controlled the Juggernaut's movement, and the working droids of the ASP series, also modified by her, monitored the armament. However, the accuracy of non-specialized droid shooting was far from ideal. Well, what do you expect from a cargo droid? But even this was quite enough to ward off uninvited guests and wild animals from the vehicle. Most of the time, Min traveled and worked on the planet Cricus 5. During the times when Min Aerithon lived, and this was in the last decades of the Galactic Republic, the A4 was already hopelessly outdated. They were very rarely seen even in the remote sectors of the mid and outer rim in the backwaters of the galaxy. Some machines by this time were in the possession of companies and corporations, used not only as combat equipment but also as trucks. There were also A4 owned by private individuals, such as Min. During their long and arduous service, the A4S participated in many local conflicts throughout the galaxy. But several decades before the Clone Wars, the A4 model was almost entirely replaced by the A5 modification, which the soldiers commonly referred to the Juggernaut as the rolling slab due to its brute size and boxy appearance. The A5 would later be largely replaced by the A6. Oh, those were fun times indeed. Times when the problem of the Republic's integrity had been festering, ripening, and even rotting for a long time. What was lacking were those who would decisively cut down the rotten tree of Republican statehood. Mega-corporations did whatever they wanted. Pirates and slavers became so brazen that they had their own planets, and even quasi-states. Besides this, large armies of mercenaries, a sort of condottieri of the galaxy far, far away. Some individual planets and planetary systems formerly only were part of the Galactic Republic. In reality, they did whatever they wanted and twisted all the Republican laws, along with the lawmakers, around their fingers. And the Republic, it couldn't do anything about it. There was no unified army. For 300 years before the Clone Wars, everyone handled their security on their own. So they armed themselves with whatever they could and with whatever money and audacity they had. In richer sectors and systems, it was quiet, well-fed, and peaceful. Pirates weren't seen, banditry was more or less under control, and wars were infrequent. But in the outer rim worlds, chaos and madness reigned. The one with the more powerful gun was right. In that contentious era, the security of a small state could only be guaranteed by the clever proclamations of the Galactic Senate, which dearly loved to express concerns and call for peace after very long discussions and agreements. The establishment of peace was facilitated as best it could be by the Justice Corps and the Jedi, who shuttled across the galaxy like crazy back and forth. But in the absence of a unified Republican army, this was insufficient. In general, transparency, democracy, and human rights abounded, the rights of the person whose army was stronger. In this murky water of galactic politics, everyone was fishing for their golden financial fish who were not lazy. Especially not lazy were the companies and corporations engaged in the production of weapons and military equipment. One of the most respected on the weapons market was the Cockpit Corporation. It was the mother, father, and later the undertaker of the hero of today's video article. Unfortunately, sources do not provide the exact year or even decade when the first Juggernaut Model 5 was assembled at the Cockpit Drive Yards factory, the A5 model. It is only noted that several decades before the Clone Wars, these A5 juggernauts already reigned supreme on the battlefields. Formally, the A5 were a deep modernization of the fourth model, but frankly speaking, they had little in common. What united them was the principle of weapon placement, some common layout elements, and the retractable telescopic tower, common traits of almost all Juggernaut models. The main difference was the wheeled chassis. Normally, wheels are inferior to tracks in terms of cross-country capability, but not this time. The 5 significantly outperformed the 4 in maximum speed, and was in no way inferior in cross-country capability. All thanks to very clever wheels, which I will tell you about later. Most likely, tracks were replaced with wheels due to the greater resource of wheeled transport and because wheeled machinery is much easier to maintain than tracked machinery. And at such sizes, replacing a wheel is still somewhat easier than reattaching a thrown track, although there was also plenty of hassle with replacing wheels on the Juggernaut. Another reason for abandoning tracks was speed. A tracked chassis, due to the nature of its design, will never allow a vehicle of such size and weight, around 450–500 tons, to accelerate to 200 kilometers per hour. And this was exactly the speed of the A5 Juggernaut. For example, the XR-85 tank droid, which was also a rarity in the world of armored vehicles, could only accelerate to 70 kilometers per hour, although that's still a lot. But in fairness, incredibly fast-tracked vehicles did exist in the galaxy far, far away. As an example, we can consider the compact assault vehicle wheeled PX-10, whose maximum speed was 260 kilometers per hour. However, the PX-10 was merely 5 meters 10 centimeters in length and about 2 meters in height, with a mass of less than 10 tons. Therefore, it cannot serve as an argument in this dispute. The length of the Juggernaut 5 model was 21 meters 80 centimeters, the height 10 meters, and with the turret, it reached all 15 meters. The A6 was noticeably larger, with a length of 49.5 meters, a width of 19 meters, 60 centimeters, a height of almost 20 meters, and with the extended turret, 30 meters, 40 centimeters. For comparison and to understand how significant this is, the height of a 9-story residential building ranges from 27 to 30 meters. Imagine the feeling of an opponent when something the height of a multi-story building, moving at speeds from 160 to 200 kilometers per hour, charges at them, shooting and being almost impossible to destroy. Can you imagine? After this, it is not surprising why, upon the appearance of juggernauts, the separatists and then the rebels could often be found studying the science of long-distance running with full gear. Repulsor lift chassis also possess good mobility and speed, but such large armored vehicles were rarely made to be repulsor lift. As you surely know, no repulsor lift vehicle can overcome a shield and can easily be pinned to the ground by an ion blast or storm, and the repulsor lifts for a juggernaut would need to be very powerful, necessitating the installation of a corresponding power plant. Even the Juggernaut's reactor might not have been sufficient, and earplugs and good headphones would be required for everyone, because the mechanics, who would then work with this machine, used to curse inventing such colorful expressions that even a seasoned sergeant or bosun's ears would curl up. After all, a repulsor lift is not the simplest thing to maintain, let alone repair. The Juggernaut was again created for the small armies of local planetary governments, including those on the outskirts, in the outer rim, far from civilization, where every year is inevitably filled with troubles and afflictions. In such places, a sturdy armored vehicle is not a luxury, but a means of survival. Well, and mobility too. In the ever-warring worlds, finding a large number of skilled mechanics was as difficult as finding a Hutt's conscience. There, simpler and more reliable technology is required. And once again, he perfectly suited this role. The executives of the Quat Corporation accurately assessed the market prospects, where the demand for heavy armored vehicles was growing each year like a snowball rolling down a hill. As soon as it went back into production, buyers were immediately found for it. After all, it's impressive to have such a wheeled titan in your army. Juggernauts were purchased by the armies of planetary states and even the criminal world, especially the Hutt clans. Mafia on tanks is serious business, and all because the sale of such powerful combat machines was not regulated by Republican laws. In addition, Juggernauts were often acquired by large corporations to protect their productions, and so to speak, for aggressive negotiations with competitors in defending corporate interests. There were even separate orders from some governors and wealthy officials who saw this formidable war machine as the ideal candidate for the role of an armored limousine. I can't help but smile at the thought of a convoy of juggernauts with flashing lights, rushing easily along the highway. Such a convoy would definitely be given way even by the most privileged citizens. When the Senate of the Old Republic finally realized the scale of the threat posed by the separatists, who had been leaving the Republic en masse in the decades between the first and second episodes, and understanding that systems and individual planetary states, without strong armed forces, would be easily captured by separatist troops in the event of war. Then the Senate adopted a resolution officially allowing all planets to have their own self-defense forces. However, even without this, all conscious governments, realizing where the Republic was heading, had long since created their own armies. Except now, all such efforts were supported by funds from the perpetually leaky Republican budget. Of course, it didn't go without the favorite pastime of high-ranking Republican officials' corruption. In short, the member states of the Republic located closer to the center and having more influence on the Senate's decisions received more subsidies from the Republican coffers. As for us in the outer rim, there is no money but keep going. Best wishes, good mood, and health. The idea of the free sale of juggernauts to all comers lasted until the establishment of the Empire, when the newly formed state began to restrict the distribution of heavy combat equipment, including juggernauts. Some A5 models were even requisitioned by the new authority. But it must be admitted that even with the Emperor's great desire, it was impossible to confiscate all the non-governmental juggernauts that had by then spread through the galaxy in hundreds of thousands. But I've jumped far ahead. We will return to the Imperial period later. All the ordered juggernauts before the Clone Wars turned out to be a trifle compared to how many of these armored vehicles were later acquired by the Kaminoans for their growing army, the future Grand Army of the Republic. But why did the clone army need juggernauts if the ATTE Walker had already been created and put into production for them? But when the adversary entrenched themselves on more or less open terrain, dug trenches, surrounded themselves with guns and anti-tank missiles, and built bunkers, there were only two options: either play tactical games, straining one's brain to find detours and cunning solutions, or blast away with all the ground artillery, adding turbo laser strikes from space. And if the enemy covered themselves with a deflector shield and mockingly made obscene gestures towards the Republic soldiers, with the firm belief that a clone's boot wouldn't reach their overconfident separatist rear end, what then? Attacking separatist positions was possible, of course, but it would cost too much cloned cannon fodder and a lot of armored vehicles, including the revered ATTEs. So, while defeating the Separatists was desirable, suffering enormous losses was not. In short, in some situations the Grand Army needed a heavier, better armored, and better armed vehicle. But built within the same concept. A super-heavy IFV with assault tank capabilities. A tank with such armor that not every anti-tank gun could penetrate it, and any handheld anti-tank launcher would be like a fly swatter to an elephant. The Republic Army required a super-heavy armored vehicle, armored cars. The Kaminoans, as in the case of the ATTE and some other equipment, ordered an already existing combat machine. This was the Juggernaut A5 model, and this was the correct decision. Why spend the funds allocated for Army creation on ordering development, testing, mass production, and other processes when there was already a perfectly good wheeled monster being produced serially? However, during the war, the Juggernaut A5 proved insufficient, and the Republic Military Command wanted an even bigger and meaner machine. Based on the experience of operating the A5 before and during the Clone Wars, a new machine was created. Thus, the Juggernaut A6 was born. It was designed, tested, and put into production a year and a half after the start of the war. Despite the late start, the scale of production was such that by the end of the war, around the 19th year before the Battle of Yavin, the A6 had almost completely supplanted the A5 model. However, both continued to fight side by side until the final shots of the war and then served loyally in the Galactic Empire. It was only the appearance of the AT-AT Walker that caused the Juggernauts to relinquish supremacy, but the Juggernauts continued to fight throughout the Galactic Civil War and even afterwards. Now, let's examine the design of the most widely produced and largest model of the Clone Wars period, the Juggernaut A6. This is the one you saw on the Kashyyyk battlefield in Episode 3. Let's start with the suspension. This may not be as exciting as an overview of the weaponry, but it is very important because the wheels of this machine are anything but simple. The Juggernaut was driven by 5 pairs of wheels mounted on a massive frame. The wheels of the A5 were of a relatively simple design, resembling the wheels on heavy-duty trucks in the real world. They had a large width and diameter to provide the vehicle with acceptable off-road capability while exerting relatively low ground pressure. However, the wheels of the A6 were something astonishing. Due to the noticeably increased dimensions of the armored vehicle, solid wheels were no longer suitable, as even a small bump caused significant tilting of the entire structure, which could ultimately lead to a rollover. Therefore, a new type of wheel was created, consisting of 3 independently rotating segments. This meant that if the wheel hit an obstacle about a meter high, such as a tree trunk, rock, or an unlucky droid, one of the segments would rise, adapting to the obstacle's dimensions, while the other 2 remained level. The crew and troops might not even notice the obstacle. Incidentally, the fate of these so-called obstacles that had the honor of being rolled over by the Juggernaut was unenviable. The weight of the armored vehicle and the sturdy wheels allowed for virtually all of the Confederacy's droids to be transformed into flattened scrap metal. Juggernaut crews often utilized this additional, so to speak, weapon with enthusiasm, crushing everything from buildings to machinery. The wheel segments had their own servos and shock absorbers. Additionally, each wheel was equipped with a spiral cylindrical spring with hydraulic absorbers, similar to the Israeli Merkava tank in the real world. Ancestors of such absorbers were widely found on tanks of the 1930s and 1940s, such as the legendary T-34 tank. And that's strange. In my opinion, torsion bars would have looked more appropriate on the Juggernaut. Torsion suspension takes up less space and is less vulnerable to enemy fire. And even better would look the hydropneumatic suspension, like that of the modern British Challenger tank. As a result, despite the significantly increased dimensions, the creators of the A6 managed to give the machine the same good cross-country capability as the A5 model. The wheels had a diameter of about 3.5 meters and a width of about 1 meter. The ground clearance of the 6th model was almost 2 meters. This provided a curious tactical advantage. Dismounted infantry could, for a time, move under the Juggernaut, like under the roof of a medieval battering ram. And there, they could also take cover from an air raid. The Juggernaut had 2 control stations. This unusual engineering solution for Star Wars was due to the large turning radius, the circulation of the machine, and also the inability, unlike the AT-AT, to turn in place. If the Juggernaut urgently needed to change direction while being on a narrow street, in a canyon or in another narrow space where turning was impossible or difficult, the mechanic driver and the commander could move to the rear post or hand over control to the rear mechanic driver. Characteristically, the speed of movement in reverse was the same as forwards. If there were crews simultaneously in the front and rear cabins, and there was no coordination between them, an unpleasant situation could arise. If the mechanic drivers in both cabins simultaneously attempted to maneuver in different directions, the system could fail, and so to speak, lock the wheels. After this, in the best case, the machine would stop, and in the worst, the transmission could break, and in the really bad case it could overturn. The presence of 2 control stations on the Juggernaut is not only justified from a military logic point of view, but is also a kind of reference to real armored cars of the first half of the 20th century. The maximum speed of the Juggernaut model. A5 was 200 kilometers per hour, while the A6 accelerated to 160 kilometers per hour, which was also quite decent. However, the crews seldom pushed their vehicles to maximum speed, preferring to stick to cruising speed. The fact is that due to the large mass, inertia, and placement of the center of mass of the armored car, safely executing sharp turns for the A6 was possible only at speeds no greater than 25 kilometers per hour. Turning at high speeds posed a risk of overturning. The A5 and A6 had a range of, attention, 30,000 kilometers on a single reactor fill. Such a range significantly enhanced the autonomy of units equipped with Juggernauts. Movement of the armored car was controlled by 2 crew members, who viewed the harsh and inhospitable world through a large viewing slit, protected by a thick layer of transparent steel. In case you're not aware, this is a transparent type of steel. It is often used to make armored glass, portholes, and similar items. If necessary, the viewing slits could be covered with armor shutters, relying solely on sensor data and external view cameras for orientation. Disembarking the crew from the Juggernaut was not an easy task. The complexity of controlling the Juggernaut and the need for precise terrain navigation necessitated the inclusion of a navigator in the crew. His workstation was behind the right driver mechanic and faced opposite to the direction of movement. However, the navigator was only present in the A6 model. For some reason, he was omitted in the A5. The 2 driver mechanics more or less handled all navigational tasks. This compartment also had a ladder leading to a hatch on the roof. At the top was a reserve observation post. Anyone stationed there was shielded from enemy fire by armor plates, protecting him from both handheld and mounted firearms. During the Clone Wars, Jedi often occupied this space, similar to how Wehrmacht soldiers would appear from the hatches of their tanks, providing a delightful target for separatist snipers. This rooftop exit could also be used by the crew for emergency evacuation. However, this was a last resort measure, as jumping from such a height would definitively result in work for trauma surgeons. In the compartment behind the cockpit were the weapon operator stations. The command post was separated from the gunners by a sturdy, blast-proof door. This ensured the vehicle's combat capability in case the frontal armor was breached and the driver mechanics were incapacitated. Incidentally, all sections without exception, across all 3 decks of the armored car, were divided by blast-proof hatches, which greatly enhanced the overall combat durability. Above the gunners was the command post. The commander of the Juggernaut, as well as Jedi not devoid of a sense of self-preservation, were located there during the battle. If the Juggernaut served as a command vehicle, the commander of the tank unit would take this position, while the vehicle commander could sit next to the mechanics drivers. To observe the battlefield, the officer had the same instruments as the mechanics drivers. The commander reached his post via a vertical ladder leading from the weapon control compartment. Behind the commander, under an armored dome, were the main sensors and scanners of the vehicle, as well as long-range and short-range communication antennas. Apparently, different models of sensors could be installed on the A6, since juggernauts with various forms of sensor domes can be seen, and even without a dome at all, with antennas under a flat roof. It should also be noted that on the 5th model, such domes were often absent altogether. Instead of a dome, there was a telescopic, retractable mechanism with an observation turret. Behind the next blast-proof door after the control post was a small infirmary with several bunks, medical instruments, and medical droids of models 21B or IM6. If necessary, this allowed the Juggernaut to be transformed into a kind of mobile hospital because these droids were capable of performing even complex surgical operations. Next was the landing compartment, occupying the entire central part of the Juggernaut. The compartment was divided into 3 decks, connected by several ladders. The compartment was modular, as it is known that the vehicle could be completely reconfigured to a cargo variant in a short time. The A5 model Juggernaut had a similar layout for the landing compartment, only with fewer decks. In the landing compartment was also the control post for the roof-mounted laser cannon. The walls of the landing compartment housed the life support system, which, in conjunction with thick armor and overall hermetic sealing, allowed the crew and paratroopers to stay inside for up to 20 days, even in areas with high radiation, zones affected by chemical and bacteriological weapons, or simply on planets where the atmosphere was unbreathable or air unsuitable for humans. The life support system, located in the walls, also played another not-so-obvious role. It served as additional armor and acted as an anti-shatter lining. In the A5 model, the autonomy was less, not exceeding 7-10 days. In the block between the wheel pairs were located the shock absorbers, gearbox, and electric motor. At first glance, not the most advantageous placement from the point of view of anti-mine protection. But this, so to speak, box was well armored, and also covered on the sides by huge wheels. Most mines in the galaxy, far, far away, are contact-triggered, which meant the wheels that directly ran over the mine sustained the most damage. Wheels, by the way, that were incredibly difficult to disable. Much harder than breaking a track. And even after losing 2 wheels on one side, the Juggernaut could still continue moving, slowly and on flat terrain, but it could somehow manage. By the way, the placement of the engine under the cargo passenger compartment offered added protection to the troops, allowing them to survive even a very powerful explosive device. I remind you that the main task of Juggernauts on the battlefield, like that of AT-ATs, was to transport infantry and support it with fire in both offensive and defensive operations. The Juggernaut A5 could carry up to 50 soldiers with full equipment. This constituted a full infantry platoon, plus a mortar squad or 2 to 3 sniper pairs. However, the Juggernaut A6 could transport from 50 to 300 soldiers at once, depending on the configuration of the troop compartment. Embarking and disembarking troops took place through 2 wide, more than 2 meters, side doors with ramps. The width of the doors allowed for the transport of light speeders, mounted blasters, cannons, and other heavy equipment along with the infantry. The placement of the doors and the height of the wheels clearly didn't allow for disembarkation on the move. Although it was possible to attempt it, as the deployed ramp extended beyond the dimensions of the wheels, preventing the brave clone or Imperial soldier from being spread thin by the wheels on the ground they came to liberate or capture. Unfortunately, the design of the bottom did not allow for a hatch. Considering the height of the ground clearance, it would have been safest to disembark troops under the Juggernaut. This way, the soldiers would have been protected from above by the entire mass of the machine and from the sides by the wheels, between which they could engage in fire, like through the loopholes of a pillbox. Besides the side doors, the Juggernaut could be exited through several hatches on the roof of the cargo passenger compartment. However, this method was inconvenient due to the size of the hatches and the need to descend very slowly from the roof of the vehicle. After all, no one in their right mind, except the Jedi, of course, would jump from the height of a multi-story building, and slowly descending down the armor under enemy fire would be a treat. A unique feature of almost all juggernauts was a retractable tower, which housed part of the sensors, a communication antenna, and an observer's position. In combat mode, the tower's barrel retracted into the hull. Although in Episode 3 you can see juggernauts counterattacking droids with their towers extended, either they didn't have time to retract them or something else. Oh, how fun it would be for a soldier in that tower if he didn't have time to descend from it. Beautiful view, but short life. At first glance, the tower seems odd and unnecessary in a galaxy dominated by high technology, where everyone actively uses drones or reconnaissance droids, data from orbit, and sensors, scanners, and other location-based gadgets from various pieces of equipment often exchange information with each other. The tower appears as a sort of atavism from wild times, but practical use has shown that such a tower is not extraneous, especially for the armies of small states, deprived of the technological wonders of their more developed neighbors in the galaxy. With the aid of the tower, the field of view significantly increases. One could literally peek behind a tall building, rise above the forest edge, look beyond a hill or the like. Thanks to the presence of sensors and video cameras there was no need to send an unfortunate observer up there. Furthermore, the tower facilitated beyond the horizon firing and was often used as a vantage point for an artillery spotter, who then relayed data to a nearby artillery battery. Without the tower, one had to rely solely on sensors, whose view was naturally limited by the terrain. Moreover, you could ask a Jedi to climb up the tower so that he could sit high and look far without spoiling the mood of regular guys with his aura of power, light side, and strange ideas on how to organize the galaxy. However, more often than not, it was not Force users, but ordinary mortals who ended up on the tower. If the data from the onboard and tower sensors were insufficient, the commander could dispatch one of the crew members or a soldier to scout the area manually with binocs. Besides this, the tower was useful as an observation point for a sentry when setting up camp. By the way, it's time to discuss the armament of the wheeled fortress. The numerous and powerful arsenal of the armored vehicle allowed it to give a worthy reception to any guests in defense, and to spectacularly crush them as quickly and colorfully as possible in the offensive. And the soldiers, shining within the belly of the machine, could add even more vivid colors to this picture with the colorful streaks of blaster discharges. The weapon of the Juggernaut A5 was controlled by 6 operators, while the A6 had 8 operators. The main caliber of the Juggernaut A6 consisted of 2 laser cannons. One of them was located on the roof, and the other above the box control post. The power of these weapons exceeded by 20% most cannons of the heaviest machinery of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, without yielding to them in effective firing range. To combat infantry and light vehicles, the Juggernaut was equipped with 2 twin-barrel rapid-fire blaster cannons mounted on turrets under the front cabin, and 2 anti-personnel laser cannons on the sides, mounted in something akin to sponsons. This cannon placement allowed for creating a significant barrage of fire along the front, capable of pinning down or dispersing even a very numerous and well-armed infantry unit, which, before meeting the Juggernaut, had the most serious intentions and a lot of bravery. Very useful were the 2 rocket launchers for guided missiles placed in retractable sponsons at the front of the vehicle. The Juggernaut could surprise the enemy with missiles of various warhead types, ranging from anti-personnel fragmentation to shaped charge, and even microproton warheads, although the latter was very rare. The launchers were not rotating, but their design allowed for launching missiles or grenades, both forward and backward. The effective launch range of the missiles was 30 kilometers. In particular, if the terrain allows and the launchers have anti-tank missiles, such a range allows destroying most enemy tanks outside their return fire range. For example, the main tank of the Separatists, the AAT, or the slightly less common droid tank NRN-99 Persuader-class droid enforcer. In the Juggernaut, I remind you, the effective guided missile launch range was 30 kilometers, and it had several dozen such missiles. and the machine's capability allowed it to engage multiple targets simultaneously. Installation of new missiles in the launcher was conducted from inside the armored vehicle, meaning that with spare missiles stored within, the carried ammunition could consist of hundreds of missiles. However, not all Juggernauts were equipped with anti-tank guided missiles, or even with missiles at all. After all, the primary adversaries of the Juggernaut were infantry, light and medium-class battle droids, fire points, light guns, mortar positions, and other similar targets. Enemy armored vehicles were a secondary target. Moreover, for most Separatist tanks, and later the Rebel Alliance's tanks, the Juggernaut's laser cannons were usually sufficient. Therefore, instead of missiles, automatic grenade launchers were often installed in these sponsons. This was in the A6 model, whereas the A5 model only had 12-shot grenade launchers with rocket grenades. But more on the A5's armament a little later. Much of the Juggernaut's weaponry could be replaced in field workshops or aboard a landing craft. Variants with rapid-firing blaster cannons instead of laser cannons were often encountered. Particularly formidable was the variant that replaced the aft laser cannon with a 6-barreled rotary blaster cannon with a high rate of fire. But it wasn't all perfect. The placement of the cannons prevented using all barrels to fire in one direction, unless the vehicle was side-on. Moreover, for the Juggernaut commander, simultaneously giving orders to driver mechanics on the direction of movement and issuing targeting commands to gunners operating different types of weaponry was no easy task. Additionally, the commander was also separated from them by several armored doors. Now imagine the headache for the commander if he was also in charge of an entire tank unit on top of it. On the other hand, such crew dispersion increased the vehicle's survivability. The described issue with control and coordination is not new. It is very characteristic of all multi-turret armored vehicles, both in fiction and in the real world. Even with the automation of several targeting and guiding processes in Star Wars, commanding a Juggernaut crew was incredibly difficult. The level of officer qualification had to be, as you can imagine, very high. Nonetheless, more about the shortcomings of the Juggernauts will be discussed later. Now, a few words about the armament of the predecessor to the 6th model, the Juggernaut A5. Its main caliber consisted of 3 laser cannons. One was located in a turret above the front cabin, and the other 2 were on the sides near the rear control post. Their firing range was 2/3 that of the AT-AT Walker's cannons, and their power, like that of the AT-AT cannons, was only slightly inferior to ship lasers. Cannons were employed to destroy enemy equipment and soldiers in field fortifications, in open terrain, and to eliminate pillboxes and permanent firing points. The positioning of cannons along the sides helped reduce the number of dead zones, preventing enemy infantry from approaching the vehicle to place a magnetic mine or any other similar unpleasant surprise. Incidentally, this tactic, despite its seeming primitiveness, was quite effective. It was in this manner that the Special Forces, Nimbus Commandos, managed to destroy several AT-ATs from an experimental series during the Battle of Jabiyim. In short, they simply jumped onto the armored vehicles, set the mines, and quickly retreated. An additional weapon of the Juggernaut Model 5 was a blaster cannon located in a turret on the roof of the hull. It was used to destroy light equipment and infantry. This same cannon was also used as an anti-aircraft gun, protecting the Juggernaut and the assault troops from airspeeders, low-flying fighters and bombers. And the last weapon of the Juggernaut A5 was the aforementioned pair of automatic grenade launchers with a total ammunition of 12 Mk4W grenades. However, in contrast to the A6 model, they were used predominantly for covering fire during troop landings and for striking enemy soldiers hiding in buildings or on the reverse slope of a hill. They could also be used to set up a smoke screen. The energy for all the aforementioned weaponry was provided in full by a nuclear reactor. The fiery heart of the armored vehicle was located in its very center, under reliable armor protection, making it nearly impossible to cause the reactor to detonate. The strength of the armor and the overall survivability of all Juggernauts were truly impressive. The cannons of most Confederacy tanks, especially laser or blaster weapons, could not penetrate its composite armor. The heat dissipation system built into the armor plates, later transferred to AT-AT walkers, significantly reduced the effectiveness of energetic anti-tank weapons. Additionally, the AT-AT inherited from the Juggernaut the means of protection against electromagnetic weapons. Although the first walkers to be massively equipped with this system were the AT-TEs, only particularly powerful tank guns could pierce the skin of the Republic Imperial monster in certain vulnerable spots, often causing minor damage. The cannons of the main separatist tank, the AAT, were not very threatening to the Juggernaut. The AAT could only cause damage by knocking out the wheels, hitting the engine compartment between the wheel pairs, or, if very lucky, incapacitating the crew by striking the control post's viewing slits. Even the self-propelled IG-227, armed with anti-tank guided missiles, could only seriously damage the wheels of a Juggernaut, and only with a salvo launch did it have some chance of taking out an A-6 by hitting all its rockets precisely in the armored vehicle. Not to mention the grenade-launching droids and various smaller caliber equipment, which could almost be ignored. But as every cunning nut has its threaded bolt, so the Juggernaut met its match. The Separatists had the J-1 proton cannons, produced by the Techno Union. This relatively small but very powerful weapon was initially designed, surprisingly, for anti-aircraft fire to protect against troop landings from large ships. And to be fair, the J-1 handled atmospheric anti-ship defense with flying colors. Remember how in the Clone Wars animated series a single battery of J-1S nearly wiped out all the acclimators attempting to land troops on riot? This proton cannon could easily pierce the Juggernaut from any distance and any projection. Nevertheless, the number of Separatist guns capable of piercing the Juggernaut could be counted on the fingers of one unlucky machinist's hand. A significant threat to Juggernauts came from the fire of large ships, frigates, or cruisers from low orbit or the stratosphere, because it was almost impossible to camouflage such a large machine. The Juggernaut was also at risk from Separatist bombers, starting with bombers like the Hyena based on the Vulture droid. However, vulnerability to aerial and space attacks was characteristic of the entire Juggernaut family, and all large-scale machinery in general. This threat could only be mitigated by constantly accompanying the Juggernauts with self-propelled anti-aircraft walkers. During the Imperial period, these were the AT-AA. The smaller sibling of the Juggernaut, the A5 model, did not have as durable armor, yet it was also very difficult to disable. Due to their combat resilience, Juggernauts sometimes transformed into command post vehicles for Jedi generals, and later for Imperial generals, a self-propelled mobile command center. It's certainly pleasant to command from within an armored fortress on wheels. I said sometimes, because during the Clone Wars, most Jedi still preferred to lead troops from the front lines or sit under the protection of an AT-AT walker. It was less protected and moved slower, but it had better possibility and was less noticeable on the battlefield. For as soon as the enormous mass of the Juggernaut appeared in the enemy's sight, everything that could shoot at it would instantly start firing. Speaking of size, what was one of the machine's advantages was also its disadvantage. Remember I mentioned the navigator in the crew? That guy wasn't there for nothing. Even the A6 Juggernaut, with its magnificent wheels, had to carefully choose its direction and pay closer attention to the map. In heavily rugged terrain, where even large walkers felt quite comfortable, the Juggernaut might not make it through. However, among the trees of Kashyyyk, Juggernauts somehow managed to squeeze, and on Yavin 4 they confidently rolled along, breaking trees and bushes. But any swamp or river deeper than 10 meters became an impassable barrier. Constructing a pontoon bridge for a Juggernaut would be an extraordinarily complex problem. Not every ordinary bridge could withstand the hundreds of tons of armored wheeled Titan. Even an AT-TE walker found it easier to stride through a swamp or shallow river, which, by the way, could be seen in the recent game Jedi Fallen Order. Substantial problems also arose with transportation, deployment, and overall logistics. Of all the ships in the Republican fleet, only the Acclimator-class assault ships had a spacious enough hold. The Venator-class Star Destroyer could not accommodate either the fifth or the sixth model of the Juggernaut, while ATTE Walkers or RX-200 Falcon tanks could be deployed already in the first landing wave, being delivered to the battlefield by LAAT-C transport variants. Deploying a Juggernaut required the landing ship to find a suitable landing spot and ensure its safety during both the descent and on the landing platform itself. Let us not forget that in the atmosphere it became very vulnerable to enemy air defense and artillery. Because of this, during the Clone Wars, and later during the Imperial period, there were several battles where the appearance of Juggernauts on the battlefield could have tipped the scales of military fortune as if 100 weight had fallen on them. But alas, the machines simply could not be delivered. Moreover, it is not enough to deliver a Juggernaut. Its functioning must also be ensured. A whole horde of living mechanics and mechanical mechanics, special models of droids, are required for a Juggernaut unit. Additionally, loader droids, regular loaders, mobile cranes, special automotive equipment, and other essentials are needed. The Juggernaut's maintainability was, to put it mildly, undesirable. Juggernauts were also quite expensive, which can be considered another drawback. A new A5 would cost 200,000 credits. Second-hand, A5S in the late Republic and early Imperial periods could be acquired for 100,000, 120,000 credits, still quite hefty. The cost of an A6 reached 350,000. For ground vehicles, the price was, to say the least, significant. Nonetheless, despite all the drawbacks, commanders and crews adored their so-called babies. Juggernauts carried out their duty with honor throughout the Clone Wars, fighting from the first to the last day. They had lots to do even after the Clone Wars, as the galaxy was still unstable. There were many who needed to be regularly dosed with large portions of Imperial blaster humanitarianism until they either understood or perished. Initially, the main problems were the remnants of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, which actively fought against the young empire for more than 2 years. There were also uprisings on planets that did not agree with the transition from Republic to Empire. There were not many of these, but they did exist. It suffices to remember Kamas, or the Combined Arms Operation on Kashyyyk. The pretext then was the fact that the furry giants harbored surviving Jedi, or one could recall the struggle against the partisans on New Plimto. Despite the jungles and swamps, Juggernauts were also used there. After Palpatine's troops dealt with the larger remnants of the Confederacy of Independent Systems and suppressed the most dangerous centers of rebellion, most of the remaining Juggernauts were sent to the Outer Rim worlds to live out the remainder of their mechanical lives. Additionally, many machines were transferred to the armed forces of the planets that were part of the Empire, provided these planets were allowed to have their own defense forces. Since the garrisons stationed in the Outer Rim were supplied on a residual basis, some units had to wait a long time for spare parts, and because of this, Juggernauts could remain in repair bays for several months, and this was despite the excellently organized Imperial logistics. In the encyclopedia, The New Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, there is an intriguing excerpt from the journal of an Imperial mechanic stationed at a garrison on Dathomir. Day 17. The front drive train on the Juggernaut 11 has failed. A request for a new part has been sent to the sector's supply service. Day 22. Resent the request regarding the replacement of the drivetrain. Day 38. The front drivetrain still hasn't arrived. Please respond. Day 50. Awaiting the arrival of the drivetrain, the Juggernaut is inoperative. Day 123. Awaiting the arrival of the drivetrain. In short, on the outskirts of the Empire, sometimes half of the entire Juggernaut fleet would turn into immovable property, becoming permanently stationary in hangars and open spaces while awaiting repairs. More resourceful governors and generals could roll out a Juggernaut to a suitable spot and convert it into an equivalent of a long-term firing point, or even a stronghold. And imagine what it was like for the Imperial garrisons lost in the backwaters of the galaxy, to whom Palpatine generously awarded decommissioned armored vehicles. However, it should not be assumed that Imperial military leaders completely wrote off the veteran. sending it to the outskirts of the galaxy. It is known that crews for the armored vehicles were trained not only in sectorial, but even in elite Imperial academies, alongside AT-AT crews. Specifically, they were trained at the prestigious Wraithal Academy. Moreover, the transfer of Juggernauts to the outer territories did not immediately spell death, as it might seem at first glance, but rather a second birth. For it was far from the center of the galaxy, where Imperial forces had to fight much more often than in the central worlds, suppressing the fiercest rebellions, eliminating the largest pirate bands, and bringing small states hostile to the Empire into submission. The Outer Rim was always lively, especially during the Imperial period. Additionally, not all Juggernauts continued to be operated as a hybrid of a heavy tank and an infantry fighting vehicle. Some, like the AT-TE Walkers, were converted by the Imperials into trucks. The A6 was particularly well suited for this role, since its cargo passenger compartment initially had a modular structure and could be quickly adapted for transporting a wide variety of cargo. However, the development of Juggernauts did not stop at the delightful pair of the A5 and A6. Early in the Empire's existence, a transport modification was created based on the A5, this time a fully fledged infantry fighting vehicle. It was called Haft B5. The letter T in the abbreviation stands for transport, and the entire abbreviation can be translated as Heavy Assault Vehicle Transport. This vehicle had an enlarged disembarkation compartment. Additionally, the B5 could carry several land speeders and speeder bikes, or light walkers such as the ATRT or ATPT. An interesting feature of the B5 was the installation of an active protection system. Anti-infantry laser cannons, supplemented by a system of improved sensors and several small laser emitters that destroyed incoming missiles. This not only protected the armored vehicle itself, but also turned it into an anti-missile defense system for nearby Allied equipment. Unlike previous models, in which the rear housed an additional control center, the rear end of the B5 Juggernaut would open up to load and unload infantry and light vehicles. Chavt B5 vehicles were used in the early phase of the Galactic Civil War, participating in battles against the Rebel Alliance, Tiber Zan's criminal empire squads, and other illegal armed formations. The fate of the B5 in the final stage of the Galactic Civil War, unfortunately, is unknown, but it is unlikely that many were built. Another non-military role that Juggernauts had to play in both the expanded universe and the so-called new canon was that of prisoner transport. In the original Star Wars, that is, in the expanded universe, the A5 was sometimes modified for this purpose. The large capacity of the transport was not needed. In such corners of the galaxy as Kessel, at the beginning of each work shift, one could observe a long line of Juggernauts stretching towards the quarry and spice mines, carrying a colorful crowd that law-abiding citizens of the Empire would most likely call vile. Thieves, murderers, traitors, war criminals, and other unsavory citizens. And in the new canon, in the movie Rogue One, Jyn Erso was transported by a Juggernaut modification A9. To be precise, the vehicle is called HCVW, a 9 turbo tank. This modification entered Imperial service after the Clone Wars and was an attempt to modernize the Juggernaut Model A5 with a focus on transport functions. In both the original and the new cases, major changes were not needed. Somewhere doors were reinforced, weapon racks were added, handcuffs were attached to the seats, and the Juggernaut was transformed into an inelegant prison transport. When the Galactic Empire began to collapse after Emperor Palpatine's first death in the Battle of Endor, a war of all against all began. Many Imperial commanders and officials tried to grab the fattest piece for themselves. Simultaneously with the ongoing Galactic Civil War, the Imperial Civil War began, which ended only in the 12th year after the Battle of Yavin, thanks to Admiral Natassi Dalla. The lady, let me remind you, simply poisoned most of the Remnants leaders. So, it wasn't enough for all the Imperial remnants to have armored vehicles for bloody infighting. And many had nowhere to replenish the losses of heavy walkers, not having the relevant factories and plants in their territory. Naturally, they then remembered about the ATTs, Juggernauts, and other legacies of the Clone Wars, some of which remained in storage warehouses just in case, while others were still seeing service in the troops. Juggernauts were also used by the aforementioned admiral. Moreover, not just for combined arms combat. In that same 12th year, after the Battle of Yavin, the fleet of Natasi Dala and Gilad Palayan attacked the Jedi Academy on Yavin 4. According to Dala, the destruction of the Jedi of the New Order should have become a symbolic beginning. A landing party, including 5 Juggernauts, was deployed to the surface of Yavin 4. You can imagine how Jedi trying to reach the crew of the armored vehicle, poking holes in it with lightsabers. Spoiler, they succeeded. Or one could recall Enix Devian, one of the leaders of the Imperial remnant, who did not attend the feeding of Imperial warlords with poisonous gases executed by Dala. This former personal assassin of Vader and Sidious led his own remnant. Lacking access to significant industrial resources, he used equipment from Imperial reserve depots. That means his soldiers fought with weapons from the Clone Wars. In his arsenal, of course, were Juggernauts. Although they did not particularly distinguish themselves under his leadership, they simply did not have time. Devian barely had time to start causing trouble before he was taken out. This happened in the 13th year after the Battle of Yavin. To one degree or another, Juggernauts fought throughout the Galactic Civil War. Some Juggernauts in working condition survived until the Yuuzhan Vong War. The Vong's scarred faces found it especially unpleasant to encounter these armored vehicles. The Vong fought fiercely in space and were quite effective against the infantry of the New Republic and the Imperial remnant. But they always had trouble with heavy armored vehicles, and in open terrain, the Juggernaut was as dangerous as the AT-8. What happened to the Juggernauts after the Vong War is unfortunately unknown, but considering how long they were operated and how massively they were produced, it is not surprising that in the armies of some small states, many carefully preserved Juggernauts could still be found. During the years of the Galactic Civil War, the Imperial Army and the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps boasted the largest number of Juggernauts in the galaxy, most of which were inherited from the Grand Army of the Republic. However, many Juggernauts continued to remain in the possession of corporations, the armies of small states, and even crime lords. Sometimes the free sale of Juggernauts was heavily restricted, leading to their occasional acquisition on the black market, with some machines ending up in the wrong hands directly from the battlefields. Due to their large size and mass, supply officers of the Grand Army of the Republic or the Empire could deem the evacuation and repair of a damaged armored vehicle economically impractical. In such cases, the Juggernaut would simply be abandoned, where it was disabled. Notably, the abandoned equipment was not always destroyed. This is where scavengers came into play. They would restore the disabled machinery and sell it to criminal cartels and rebel groups. However, the rebels themselves were never above rummaging through the trash. After all, how else were they supposed to fight? The rebels not only repaired the disabled and abandoned Juggernauts, but also modified them to the extent of their creative audacity, finances, and available parts. Sometimes the appearance of a rebel Juggernaut differed significantly from its predecessor. The differences were especially pronounced if the rebels managed to acquire only the chassis of a Juggernaut and had to craft almost the entire armored body themselves. In most cases, this resulted in a more elegant and streamlined version compared to the Republic Imperial model, which was built in the notorious squarish practical good style. The assembly quality and technical specs varied greatly. Sometimes, rebel Juggernauts even outperformed the serial Imperial machines. And other times, the quality was bad. A known case involves rebel agents purchasing a Juggernaut that had been decommissioned and sold to private individuals without weaponry. The new owners converted the armored vehicle into a large, heavy-duty mining dump truck. The rebels, having repurchased the truck, armed it once again and re-armored it. The skillful hands of the rebels, known for their ability to convert anything potentially armorable and weaponizable into military technology, then got to work. The designers would look at their creations, thoughtfully scratch their heads and wonder, can it really be done like that? The Rebel Alliance and even the New Republic used their juggernauts in the same way as the Grand Army and Imperial Army. That is, as something intermediate between a heavy breakout tank and an infantry fighting vehicle. There was an interesting modification. A group of rebel craftsmen, using a hammer, screwdriver, and some ingenuity, had attached a really big cannon to the armored vehicle. A really big one. Subsequently, they would look with bloodthirsty glares at enemy equipment, especially if the Imperial cog was painted on it, and the crew inside was bewildered, not expecting to see such in the rebels' arsenal. Fortunately for the Imperials, such rebel mechanized enhancements were encountered very rarely. It is not difficult to guess that the primary target of this Mega Walker modification was the heavy Imperial walkers, primarily the AT-AT, which the Alliance fighters and New Republic soldiers feared so badly. In the model, that cannon does not appear imposing, just like the model itself. But recall the size of the juggernauts, where even the A5 was really big. And then imagine both the length and caliber of those barrels. Size, power. This double-barreled gun could penetrate the armor of an AT-AT completely through. The price, of course, was the machine's low speed, even worse off-road capability, and reduced durability. Why weren't such cannons installed on other juggernauts? Because there simply weren't suitable targets for them. After all, both the Republic and the Empire generally dealt with regular armored vehicles, for which the power of such cannons was simply excessive. However, the Rebels and New Republic troops needed to perforate the thick-skinned Imperial walkers. The Rebels were not the Empire, and did not squander their resources. Therefore, even after transforming into the New Republic, they used their purchased trophy and refurbished juggernauts to the limit. Most Rebel juggernauts burned in the flames of the Civil War, but some managed to survive to its end and, like the Imperial machines, brought a deadly laser and rocket greeting to the Yuzhan Vong. I want to conclude my long story by mentioning the rarest modification of the Juggernaut and, in my opinion, the most unusual. The A5RX battle tank. As you can easily guess, the designers relied on the experience of developing and using the A5 model when creating this vehicle. Quat engineers perfectly understood that they had created a powerful machine, but one not boasting good off-road capability. Therefore, they thought, why do we need a transportable landing force on an armored vehicle? Why not turn an infantry fighting vehicle into a tank, a full-fledged tank? Then they thought, why do we need wheels? Let's go back to tracks, like on the A4 model. Said and done. And here is what they ended up with, a 5RX. And to not overly confuse the customer, they called this wonder a reconnaissance juggernaut. In the alphanumeric index, A5RX, the letter R stands for recon, reconnaissance. The letter X usually designates experimental equipment, although this experiment became more or less serial. Well, all jokes aside, Quat Drive Yards produced an interesting machine. Pretty fast, maneuverable, and with good off-road capability, yet also possessing armor like the A5 model. The armament of the A5RX was considerably larger and more powerful. 2 twin-barreled rapid-fire blaster cannons, 1 heavy laser cannon, and to top it off, a rocket launcher with a couple dozen rockets, the same rockets used by the A6 model. The tank's crew consisted of 5 people. After the Clone Wars, a certain number of A5RX units ended up in the Imperial Army's possession. The Imperials didn't appreciate this legacy and quite swiftly decommissioned the odd tank. However, in remote Imperial garrisons, it lingered until the appearance of the Rebel Alliance. For instance, there is known evidence of several A5RX units deployed by Imperials on Dantooine.